He set the napkin down, folded it once, stood up. 30 people watched him do it.
Quý vị,
The room
tôi đã
had
tập
gone the
hợp các
kind
vị
of
ở đây
quiet
tối
that
nay
only
vì một
happened
vấn đề
when
hệ
something
trọng.
irreversible was in motion.
Chúng ta
When the
đang
air
ở ngay đây
itself
lịch sử
understood that
và
whatever
mỗi
came
quyết
next
định
could
sẽ
not be
định hình
taken
tương
back.
lai.
She had
Is
asked him
everything
to
okay?
beg.
You seem a bit
In
off.
front of all of them.
Yeah, just a
At a
long day.
table
I'll
she
be
had
fine.
decorated herself,
We're here
in a
for
room
you,
he
you
had been
know.
quietly
Exactly.
collecting rent on for
We've got
4
your
years.
back.
He didn't beg. He said
Nobody
5
gonna go.
words, walked to the door and left. No argument, no scene, no explanation.
you're out here.
Just a man in pressed khakis walking across a parking lot in the Richmond night.
Show
Past a
yourself!
sign on the building that bore his company's name, a detail nobody at that table had ever thought to look for, including her. He got in the truck,
Gotta
started
stay
the
sharp
engine.
out here.
And somewhere behind
is
him, in the
absolutely
silence of that
beautiful.
room,
It really
30
is. The
people
food
were
is
beginning to
incredible.
understand
A
that the
toast
quietest
to
man
our
at the
wonderful
table
host.
had just
To the
made the
host.
loudest
Cheers.
possible move. The venue was a converted warehouse in Short Pump, 20 minutes west of downtown Richmond. Lorraine had worked on it for 6 weeks. String lights across the exposed ceiling beams, linen tablecloths she had pressed herself, sunflower centerpieces from the same florist she'd used for 4 years. Her signature for client events, deliberate and consistent. 30 guests, her best clients, her most important vendors, the people whose professional opinions shaped how Mitchell Catering was perceived in the Richmond food service world. Darnell had helped her load the rental van with table linens the morning before. He sat at the center table, third seat from the right, correctly placed. Not at the head, which was Lorraine's, not at the far end where presence dissolved. He knew the menu, he'd carried the linens. He had also, for 4 consecutive years, received a check on the 15th of every month from the company that held the sublease on this building. Nobody at the table knew that last part. Victor Bryant sat 2 chairs to Lorraine's left. Victor was 41, restaurant owner, Broad Street. 4 years in, the website had professional photographs. The reviews mentioned atmosphere. Victor himself had the presentation of a man who had studied what successful people looked like and executed the study precisely. Good suit, unhurried manner, the ability to make a conversation feel like it had been anticipated specifically for the person he was talking to. Darnell had seen Victor's category before. Not personally, professionally, the operation that photographed well, the pitch that held together until someone asked about the receivables. He had already asked. He would get to that. Lorraine stood up. The hesitation in this moment had happened weeks ago, maybe months ago, in whatever private rehearsals had shaped it into the thing it now was. By the time she rose from her chair, the moment had been decided and refined, and decided again until it had the form she wanted. She looked at Darnell directly. Not the way you looked at someone when the conversation was between you. The way you looked at someone when the point was that everyone else in the room could see you doing it. Her voice was controlled. It carried well. She had always had a good voice for rooms, Darnell. If you have any dignity left, you can either get on your knees and ask me to stay married to you, or you can get out of my event. 30 people. He counted them the same way he counted inventory. Not from anxiety, because counting was accurate and accuracy was useful, and this was a moment that deserved accurate accounting. The room went the kind of quiet that fell when something irreversible had just been said in front of witnesses. When 30 people understood simultaneously that whatever came next would be the version of this evening they remembered, something shifted in Darnell's chest, not broke, shifted. The way a loaded pallet shifted when the forklift set it down harder than expected. The structure holding, the weight redistributed. He thought about the morning they moved into the Beechwood house. 2nd year of the marriage. Lorraine had asked how he took his coffee. He'd said black, no sugar. She had remembered it for 2 years without being reminded. Not as performance, as the simple attentiveness of someone who was paying attention. He tried to remember the last time she had poured it without asking again. He could not. Victor Bryant had gone still 2 chairs to Lorraine's left. Not uncomfortable. Waiting. The attentiveness of a man watching something arrive at the conclusion he had contributed to. Darnell looked at that stillness for 1 second, then he placed his napkin on the table. Folded it once, not statement habit. Stood. I hope everyone enjoys their evening. He walked through the front of the venue, through the heavy industrial door, and out into the parking lot without looking back. The door closed behind him with the weight of something that had been built to stay shut, The lot was lit by overhead fixtures that hummed faintly. His pickup was in the third row. He walked to it at his normal pace. Not performance, not rush. He reached the truck and put his hand on the door handle and looked up. On the upper right corner of the building facade, where he had installed it per his specifications in 2019, a small metal placard read, Cooper Property Management Group. Leasing inquiries through listed contact. He had sublet this space to Mitchell Catering 4 years ago. $840 a month. The check came reliably on the 15th. He stood in the parking lot and looked at the placard. He did not feel irony or satisfaction, or the particular gratification of a man who had just discovered a cosmic endorsement of his position. He felt tired. The way you felt tired when something you had hoped would hold had ended in a public room, and you were standing in a parking lot on a Wednesday night deciding what came next. He got in the truck. His phone rang before he reached the I-64 on-ramp. He let it run. It rang 4 more times in 11 minutes. He drove home, ate the leftovers in the refrigerator, sat at his desk in the second bedroom, routing ledger, dual monitors, the filing system he had maintained since 2007, and did not open the laptop. He sat there for a while, then he went to bed. The alarm came at 4:47. Same as every morning, he made coffee, black, no sugar, said aloud to no one, and drove to the distribution center on Dabney Road. At the dock by 5:15, first truck through the gate at 5:22. He stood with the clipboard in one hand and the coffee in the other and watched the day begin its sequence. Cooper Distribution Group had started in a second-floor office on Broad Street that smelled permanently of old carpet and shared copier ink. September 14, 2007. Darnell had been 20 years old. He had saved for 3 years toward the initial capital and had supplemented it with a documented loan of $47,000 from a woman named Lorraine Mitchell, whom he had been dating for a year and who had offered the money with the directness of someone who understood the difference between charity and investment. He had written the promissory note himself using standard language, because his grandfather had taught him that informal agreements between people who trusted each other were the most reliable source of expensive complications. He had repaid the loan in full 11 months before the wedding. Clean transfer, marked satisfied, moved to Lorraine's personal savings account, 2 leased refrigerated trucks, a regional grocery contract he had won on his 3rd application. He had filed the first 2 rejections in a manila folder without annotation, because his grandfather had also taught him the difference between filing something professionally and filing it personally, and the professional version required no commentary. His grandfather, Elias Cooper, had run a freight operation out of a converted warehouse on Hull Street in Richmond South Side for 22 years. He had died in 2015, 4 months before Darnell attended a Richmond Food and Beverage Association mixer and met a woman in a burgundy dress who was working a hotel catering manager with the efficient focus of someone who understood that the quality of the next sentence was often the difference between yes and no. Elias had believed 2 things about running a business. Keep a handwritten ledger alongside whatever software you use. A man who cannot read his own numbers by hand can be taken by anyone with access to the software, and stay quiet long enough and people will tell you exactly what they think of you. What they think of you tells you everything about what they can and cannot see. Darnell had kept both principles. The ledger was on his desk now, 4th volume, navy blue cover, pages maintained in his grandfather's style, neat, left margin anchored, no space wasted. He walked the dock at 5:15 every morning, not because the system required it, but because he believed that what you owned was only as sound as your willingness to be present inside it. He had been watching the weight of the last several months building. The voicemails were waiting when he sat down at the desk the morning after the dinner, 5 of them. He played them in sequence, start to finish, complete context before response, the same way he processed any information that mattered. The first, Lorraine's voice controlled but strained at the edges. Call back, we need to talk. The second, 4 minutes later, less controlled. What he had done, leaving in front of everyone without engaging, was humiliating. She had expected more maturity. The third, the deliberate evenness of someone who had stepped back from the edge. Don't make decisions you'll regret. Talk first. The fourth, just his name. Then the call ended, the fifth, 8 minutes after the fourth, measured. She'd been unfair in how she handled the evening. They should talk. He sat with the 5 voicemails for a moment, then he put the phone face down, opened the laptop, Monday, which meant the cloud backup report had come in at 6:03 a.m., same as every Monday. He had built the server configuration himself in 2019. Not complicated, but thorough. Activity across all 3 business locations archived automatically. Report to his personal email every week. He read it the way he read all operational data, without urgency, looking for the pattern that emerged when you stayed patient. He read it now. 23 documents downloaded from the shared business drive to an external device. 3 sessions. Tuesday evening, 11:17 p.m. to 12:44 a.m. The following Thursday, 10:58 p.m. to 12:20 a.m. The Monday after, 11:32 p.m. to 1:03 a.m. He had been asleep during all 3. He read the file names. Cooper Distribution Group quarterly financials, 3 most recent years. Federal contract renewal letters from the DC procurement offices. Current routing agreements with all 62 clients. Vendor network documentation. And one more. He read the file name twice, the signed service agreement between Cooper Distribution Group LLC and Mitchell Catering LLC. The document governing terms, rates, the internal pricing structure he had maintained without revision, because she was his wife, and the arrangement served both businesses, and he had not needed to press the outstanding balance. She had taken his business documents. He closed the laptop, put both hands flat on the desk. 30 seconds then he called Damon. Damon Clark ran a one-man IT operation out of an office park in Henrico County. 6 years working with Cooper Distribution. Neither of them wasted the other's time. IP trace on an external device that accessed my network. 3 sessions. I'll forward the timestamps. How fast? Today if you can. Damon called back at 2:47 p.m. The address resolved to a registered network belonging to Kemper & Watts. Family law practice. West Broad Street, Richmond. Darnell sat with that for a long time. Lorraine had retained a divorce attorney. Not in response to the dinner. The first download session was 6 weeks before the dinner. She had been building a file on his company for 6 weeks. Selecting the documents, structuring the case. The dinner had not been impulsive. It had been the end of a process. The final public move in a sequence that had been running for 3 months without his knowledge. He pulled the service agreement she had taken and ran the invoice history. 4 years at the internal rate. Total billed, $218,000. Total paid, $124,000. Outstanding balance carried as deferred receivables, $94,000. He had never pressed it. She was his wife. He hadn't needed to. He pulled the company formation documents. The promissory note from 2008. The bank records from the year before the wedding. The repayment was there. Full transfer. Marked satisfied. Lorraine's personal savings account. 11 months before the ceremony, she had told her attorney she had invested $47,000 in his company. He was certain of this the way he was certain of things that followed logically from available information. It was the only version of that story that gave her counsel a foundation to argue equitable interest in a business that had been running for 8 years before she knew his last name. But it was not an investment. It was a documented loan, repaid in full, a year before the marriage that would have needed to exist for the investment theory to carry any weight. He went through the shared calendar. Tuesday evenings, 11 weeks running, labeled ADR-MTG, 6 o'clock, alternative dispute resolution. The first entry appeared 9 weeks before the document downloads began. 13 weeks before the dinner, 3 months of planning. He opened a new folder on the desktop, named it Cooper v. Mitchell, organized the documentation in sequence, formation records, repayment confirmation, invoice history, server logs, IP trace. Then he pulled the commercial lease on the short pump venue, master tenant. Broad Property Management LLC, as a subsidiary of Cooper Property Management Group, registered in Virginia in 2016. Mitchell Catering had been a tenant since year 1. 4 years, $840 a month, checks on the 15th, total paid to a company her husband owned without ever connecting the name on the invoice to the name she shared. $40,320. He sat with the complete picture. Then he called Angela Young. Angela Young had practiced on Grove Avenue for 25 years. Her office reflected the priorities of someone who had stopped needing to signal competence a long time ago and was focused entirely on producing it. Furniture that was good and old. Bookshelves organized by function. She was 60, with the precision of a woman who had been underestimated by opposing counsel, often enough to have built an entire methodology around the gap between how she appeared and what she knew. She reviewed the folder on a Wednesday morning, no commentary until the invoice summary. Then she looked up over her reading glasses. She claimed a $47,000 equity stake in a company you repaid before the marriage. Correct. Transfer documented. Note marked satisfied, she set the page down. Randall at Kemper and Watts will not have seen the repayment record. She either forgot it or believed it was buried well enough that Discovery wouldn't surface it in time. Darnell said nothing. When he receives our Discovery response, the equity claim dissolves. That creates its own complications for her. Angela tapped the invoice summary. The $94,000 in outstanding receivables is a legitimate business claim. We file it as a counterclaim. It changes the financial picture of this proceeding immediately. She turned to the venue documentation. Read it once. Read it again. 4 years of sublease payments to your property management subsidiary. She removed her glasses. She held the event where she gave you a public ultimatum in a building she had been renting from your own company. Yes. Angela allowed herself one moment of something not quite satisfaction but occupying the space adjacent to it. Then it passed. The sublease renewal is in 58 days. 57. She made a note. Said nothing more about it. Your job, she said, is exactly what it has always been. Move nothing, change nothing. Let her believe the next month proceeds as she expects. He nodded, drove back to Dabney Road, walked the dock. That Sunday he drove to Chesterfield. Harold Reed was 67, retired, and had driven the first truck Darnell ever put on the road. A leased refrigerated unit with a summer temperature problem that Harold had raised every August for 2 years before Darnell could afford to replace it. Harold had been there from the first contract, from the first moment anyone looked at Cooper Distribution as something that might become more than a regional operation held together by optimism and a borrowed routing system. Harold listened to all of it without interrupting. He turned his coffee mug slowly in both hands. Something to do while his mind worked, and when Darnell finished, there was a moment of quiet. You know what your grandmother used to say. Darnell waited. Don't show everything on the truck. Some cargo doesn't need to be visible to be valuable. Harold looked at his nephew with the steadiness of a man who had watched people make decisions for 40 years and understood the difference between the ones driven by feeling and the ones driven by position. She knew what you were going to build before you did. She also knew there would be somebody who didn't look hard enough to understand what it was. A pause. Lorraine didn't look. No, Darnell said. Harold set down the mug. Victor Bryant. His supplier account at Gerald's has been 2 months past due. Gerald mentioned it at the lodge. The restaurant is struggling. He looked at Darnell steadily. That man has been presenting himself as something he is not currently in a position to be. Harold was right. Angela's investigative contact had the full financial profile on Victor Bryant within a week. 1 location, Broad Street, 4 years operating. Supplier debt $212,000 across 7 vendors, not 1 or 2 slow accounts. 7. The pattern of a business spending beyond what it earned and servicing the gap with credit it could no longer extend. Commercial lease 90 days from default notice. Kitchen equipment financing delinquent since February. A cure notice in April. Another in June. Account never brought current. The restaurant looked successful from the outside. The outside was the only part that was. Darnell had been in business long enough to know that a struggling enterprise was a structural failure, not a moral one. Victor had built something that required a different discipline than the one he had. The discipline of appearances was a real skill. It just was not the skill that kept a lease current. What Darnell felt reading the report was not satisfaction. It was the resigned clarity of a building inspector walking a property that had been represented as sound. Nothing in the document surprised him. Every line confirmed what he had already read in the way Victor occupied rooms. The performance of a man holding a position he was no longer financially qualified to fill. And Lorraine was measuring what she wanted against that performance. She was making plans against a backdrop that was 90 days from collapse she could not see. That was her situation to encounter on her own timeline, not his to announce. Lorraine called him a week after the dinner. She used the word reasonable twice in one sentence, the word of a person who had been advised by counsel to project cooperative pragmatism. He said he thought a conversation was a good idea. They met at a restaurant on Patterson Avenue. She was warm. The contained warmth of a woman who believed warmth was still a functional instrument. She asked how he was. She said she hoped they could handle things without everything becoming complicated. Darnell ate the food, answered what she asked nothing that wasn't directly responsive to what she had raised. His face remained what it always was. Midway through the entree she said, "I just want things to be fair. I contributed to this life. I think that deserves recognition." He looked at her. "You did contribute. That's true. Nothing more." She shaped that sentence into what she needed it to be. He watched her do it. Watched her decide that his agreement with that narrow true statement meant he understood her position and was open to what it implied. She left the dinner satisfied that the situation was moving in the direction she expected. He drove home, added a note to the folder, went to bed. Angela called the following Monday. "The counterclaim has been filed. Randall received it this morning. He called my office twice before noon. His read? He's a capable attorney. He'll reassess his client's position. That's the process working as it should." A shorter pause. "Two of Mitchell Catering's 5 largest accounts originated through introductions you made through Cooper Distribution's vendor network. I'm not suggesting you use that as leverage. I'm suggesting you understand the complete picture." He understood it. He also understood what Angela hadn't said, that those relationships were sustained by professional gravity that existed because he was behind it. Not actively managed, just present, in the way that 15 years of trucks running on time and invoices being accurate built the kind of reputation that didn't require maintenance because it had become structural. He opened the routing ledger to a blank page, wrote one thing. 55 days on the sublease, closed it. The week ran normally, which was the point. 5:15 at the dock, clipboard, coffee, first truck at 5:22 or 5:24 depending on northwest traffic. Dispatch board green by 7. Mid-morning check-in with Terry Coleman. Terry had been with Cooper Distribution for 6 years. Darnell had promoted him to operations manager in March. Not because of ambition or charisma, Terry had neither in excess, but because of a specific quality of attention. He noticed things, discrepancies in load weights, route timing patterns that shifted by minutes in ways that pointed to conditions rather than coincidence. He reported what he observed without adding interpretation, which was the rarest and most valuable quality in a supervisor. The promotion had freed Darnell for the work he had been building toward. Contract development, federal relationship management. The longer horizon that required the kind of patient attention daily operations consumed rather than produced. He had been cultivating a 4th federal relationship for 2 years. Department of Defense Logistics Facility, northern part of the state, regional food supply chain management. The proposal had been in review for 8 months. He checked the status on Wednesday. No update. Federal procurement moved at its own pace. Urgency was not a useful posture toward it. He filed the check and moved on. Lorraine called on a Thursday evening. Her voice carried a different texture than the Patterson Avenue dinner. Less performed, more actually uncertain. She asked if they could speak. He said she could come by the Dabney Road office if she wanted. A pause long enough to carry meaning. "I'll come by," she said. She arrived at 6:30. The dock had quieted. Terry's handoff notes were on the desk. The office had the smell of a workplace that was cared for without being decorated. She stood in the doorway and looked at the room with the expression of someone seeing something familiar through a different frame. She had been here before. The first 2 years of the marriage, meeting him here on Fridays before dinner, sitting across the desk asking questions about freight logistics out of genuine curiosity. He had liked that about her. Present tense, past circumstance. She sat across from him. "Jeffrey says the counterclaim changes things significantly." "That's accurate. The 47,000. She stopped. "Reorganized. I didn't. I genuinely forgot about the repayment. I wasn't trying to." He waited. She stopped again. This time differently. Not strategy, not recalibration. the halt of a person who had started a sentence and reached a junction where several honest things could be said, and none of them were comfortable. I believed it was a contribution, she said. I know the document said loan. I know. But I told myself a different version. I know, he said. That was harder to sit with than an accusation would have been. The quiet acknowledgement without condemnation required her to own what she had told herself without the relief of defending against a charge. She sat with it for a moment. What happens now? Angela and Jeffrey work through the remaining terms. The counterclaim gets resolved. The decree gets finalized and the sublease. He said nothing. She nodded. The nod of someone accepting an answer they had already worked out but needed confirmed. She stood, straightened her jacket, said, not asking, not arguing, just laying something down. I did build something real. Whatever else is true, I want you to know I know that. I know you know it, he said. She left. He sat in the quiet after her footsteps faded, then opened the routing ledger and updated the Thursday column. Harold called on a Saturday morning while Darnell was at the Westover Hills bungalow, a 1940s craftsman 3 blocks from the James River that he had purchased in April and been working on himself on weekends. He had started with the structural inspection, foundation, roof, load-bearing walls, all sound. The previous owner had let cosmetic maintenance lapse but had not neglected anything that carried weight, good bones. Everything else was surface work. He had been laying hardwood in the main room, on his knees with a pneumatic nailer, working east wall toward the back window. The satisfaction was physical and specific. Placement of each board, the pattern advancing across the subfloor, the sound of the nailer seating the board correctly. Gerald's lodge dinner was last night, Harold said. Victor Bryant came up again. Default notice on his lease came through officially. September 1st. The landlord's attorney isn't interested in another payment plan. 2 of the 7 supplier accounts have referred to collections. Gerald heard directly from one of the reps. Darnell leaned against the wall. 3 boards still loose, waiting. How's Gerald's account? 90 days out with no resolution. He's written it down as a loss, which meant the terminal sequence was already running. Collections, referrals showed on the business credit record. Once they showed there, future financing became either impossible or prohibitively expensive. A food service operation with active supplier relationships had no runway without financing flexibility. Lorraine doesn't know, Harold said. Not a question, no. She's going to. Yes. On her own timeline, Harold was quiet. The background of his Chesterfield house came through. A television in another room, the Saturday morning quiet of a retired man's house. Your grandmother used to say that the hardest lesson wasn't learning to read people. It was accepting you couldn't do the reading for them. A pause. She also used to say the truck moves whether the cargo understands the route or not. Darnell put the phone in his pocket, picked up the nailer, placed the next board, the clean. The bungalow was 3 weekends into the floor. He had drafted the renovation sequence on the back of a routing sheet the evening after the walkthrough. Room by room, structural first, subfloor before hardwood, electrical before walls, kitchen before bathrooms, because the kitchen was what a house organized itself around. He had built the kitchen cabinets from scratch over 3 weekends in July. Dimensional lumber from the millwork supplier on Hull Street. Shaker style, flush overlay. The kind of cabinetry that would correctly in a 1940s craftsman for the next 50 years. He had stained them with a sample he held against the cabinet door in 3 different lights, choosing the one that looked right without knowing until the second coat why it looked right. The color matched the desk that had sat in his grandfather's warehouse on Hull Street for 22 years. He did not reconsider the stain. He was 2/3 through the main room floor, each board a completed unit, each row a visible record of the distance covered. Angela called that Monday with an update. Lewis had come back with a revised position. The equitable interest claim was gone. He had reviewed the repayment documentation over the weekend and reached the same conclusion Angela had anticipated. What remained? Property division, spousal support, counterclaim resolution. He wants to settle at 65, your read? 61 is achievable. He knows the claim is solid and his client needs to resolve her liquidity to fund the transition. A pause. She'll also need the sublease extension addressed. She has events booked at Short Pump through end of year. Darnell was quiet for a moment. 39 days remained on the current lease. The renewal date is in 42 days, he said. Yes, she has 42 days to make alternative arrangements. That is accurate. Angela's tone carried the neutrality of an attorney confirming fact without recommending position. I wanted you to have the full picture before the next session, he told her he did. They set the next session for the following Thursday. He sat at the routing desk after the call. The sublease was a business decision. He had thought it through carefully enough to be certain of that. The space had been offered at market rate, renewed annually, managed through the normal property management process. Mitchell Catering had received the same service any tenant received. The fact that Darnell held the master lease had never been secret. It was filed with the county, registered with the State Corporation Commission, available to anyone who looked. Lorraine had not looked. That was not his to absorb. What was his to decide was the kind of man he intended to be in the resolution of this. He had no interest in engineering difficulty for its own sake. But he also had no obligation to extend an arrangement that no longer served either side. He emailed his property management coordinator. Standard notification. Short pump sublease would not be renewed at expiration. 42 days, as the agreement required. Then he finished the week's ledger entries. Here was the thing about the nights, not dramatic ones. Not the kind where a man sat in the dark with something in a glass and felt sorry for himself. Just the ordinary evenings when the work was done and the house was quiet and there was nothing requiring attention, and the quiet had a texture different from the quiet of working hours. Different the way an empty freight truck sounded different from a loaded one. Same vehicle, same road, different weight. He was not grieving the marriage the way grief was expected to work, sudden, consuming, visible. He was processing it the way he processed everything. Systematically. Each element as it arrived. The coffee thing had arrived first. He had started saying his preference aloud before making it. Black, no sugar, as if stating it prevented it from being forgotten. Which was not rational. He was making his own coffee. No one was going to get it wrong. He said it anyway, because Lorraine had remembered for 2 years, and now she was not there. And he was in the habit of having been remembered. That was a specific and small grief, and he did not enlarge it. But he did not reduce it either. He said it in the empty kitchen before driving to the dock. Every morning, Harold called on a Wednesday. Not about Victor, not about the proceedings, just to talk. Harold picked up on the second ring and they went 40 minutes on things that required no resolution. Harold's engine rebuild on the 1971 Ford, the Lodge Fall fundraiser, and the particular organizational frustration generated exclusively by volunteer committees. The weather, Richmond in late September, warm days and cold nights, the James trees beginning to turn. Darnell talked, and found that conversation about things without strategic weight was its own kind of relief. The release of setting a load down, not because the load had been wrong to carry, but because setting it down reminded you that you were capable of moving without it. Near the end, Harold said, "You eating right?" "Yes, sleeping, mostly." "Good. Your grandfather used to say that a man who doesn't eat and sleep is trying to run a truck without fuel. You can push a ways on fumes." "Not far," Darnell said he understood. He did the Thursday before the mediation. He drove to Dabney Road in the dark as usual. Picked up the clipboard at the office door, set it back on the hook, walked out to the dock without it. Not statement, not symbolism. Just the recognition that there was a version of presence that required instruments and a version that did not, and this morning, before a day that would call for a different kind of attention than routing, he wanted the second version, diesel, cold air. The pre-dawn dark of an October morning in Virginia. Not the full dark of summer but a partial dark, the eastern sky already showing the first suggestion of change. He thought about the mediation the way he thought through any complex sequence before beginning. The mental walkthrough of a route, stops confirmed in order, load verified before the truck left the dock. Everything was in position, and then he thought about Lorraine, with more honesty than he had allowed himself since the dinner. Not the Lorraine of the last several months, the strategic one, the one who had said reasonable twice and sat across from him at Patterson Avenue performing cooperative pragmatism. The earlier one. The one who had sat across his desk on Friday evenings and asked questions about freight logistics out of actual curiosity. The one who had made his coffee correctly for 2 years without a reminder. What had happened to that person was not a mystery. She had needed to be seen, in a way that Darnell had not provided, publicly, professionally, in the register of the Richmond food service community she had built her business inside. She had needed her husband to exist in that register with her, to show up in the rooms that mattered to her and be named and be known and confirm in the eyes of the people she valued that what she was building was worth being seen building. Darnell had not been that. Not because he was incapable of it, because it had not occurred to him to try. He had been certain that what he was doing, the company, the contracts, the structure of their shared life, was sufficient evidence of commitment. It had not occurred to him that a person who never complained about the structure might be going hungry inside of it. He had been present in every operational sense of the word. He had not been present in the way that required no system, no clipboard, just the willingness to look at someone and ask what they needed that he wasn't seeing. He sat with that, did not argue it away, did not rationalize it into something smaller, just let it occupy its actual size. He had loved her. He had also failed her in a way that was his and no one else's. Both of those things were true and neither one cancelled the other. He held them both. Then the first truck came through the gate at 5:23. He stepped back into the current of the operation he had built and let the day begin its sequence. The night before the mediation, he worked the bungalow floors until 9:30. The final third of the main room, the section nearest the back wall, requiring individual measurement for every board because the wall deviated from plumb by a 1/4 inch over 12 feet. He cut at the miter saw in the backyard, carried each board in, test fit, adjusted, nailed. He cleaned up at 9:30, made dinner at the kitchen counter, the cabinets around him in the color of his grandfather's desk, the tables still covered in renovation materials, nothing set for sitting, 8 standing. Went to bed at 10:15, slept through the night. Angela called at 6:50. Randall is requesting a pre-session conference. He wants to address the counterclaim settlement before the formal session starts. You'll read? He's had a conversation with his client about the strength of our position and she's agreed to move. He mentioned 62. What do you recommend? 61. I think he comes down. If he doesn't, 62 is within acceptable range. 61. He also wants to know if the sublease decision is negotiable. The answer had been made. It isn't, Darnell said. That's what I expected. I'll see you at 9. He set the phone down, picked up his coffee, stood at the window of the north side rental house, the bungalow not yet livable, and looked at the street in the early morning light. The leaves on the block's trees were turning, yellow at the edges, the green pulling back toward center the way it always did in October. He drank the coffee, got in the truck, drove to Grove Avenue. The pre-session lasted 9 minutes. Lewis arrived with a revised figure, 61.5. Angela counted at 61 flat. Lewis conferred by phone, came back. 61. Angela looked at Darnell. He nodded. Lewis wrote it down, the sublease. He set his pen on the table. My client has 4 events booked at Short Pump between now and mid-December. She's requesting 60 days for transition. 39 days remained on the current lease. 30 days, Darnell said. If she can complete her December bookings within 30 additional days, the extension is available at standard rate. Lewis wrote it down without arguing, which meant he had come in expecting a harder no. The pre-session ended. They moved to the conference room. The morning light came through the east-facing window, at an angle that made the table's wood grain visible in a way that felt almost too physical for a room where paper arguments were about to be made. Darnell noticed it the way he noticed most things, filed it, moved on. Lorraine was already seated. Dark blue blazer, white shirt, not the gray suit, which was authority. This was steadiness. She had calculated the presentation and executed it precisely. She did not look at him immediately. He sat across from her and waited. Lewis had his reorganized binder open to a tabbed page, significantly thinner than it had been. He looked at the remaining papers with the focused calm of a professional who had absorbed a significant revision to his understanding of the case and arrived prepared to work with what was left. Angela placed the folder on the table. The first document went down at 9:14, formation, filing. Virginia State Corporation Commission. September 14, 2007. Sole proprietor, Darnell James Cooper. Converted to LLC 2011. Sole member remaining, Darnell James Cooper. Formation date, 8 years and 4 months before the marriage certificate, which Angela placed beside it so the visual proximity could do the work that argument didn't need to do. Lewis read both. Second document, promissory note, 2008. Lender, Lorraine Ann Mitchell. $47,000. Standard terms. Third document, repayment confirmation, full amount, marked satisfied. 11 months before the wedding, Angela let the three sit. The founding financial contribution your client described as an investment was a documented loan, repaid in full. Before the marriage that would have needed to exist for the investment theory to have any merit, Lewis set his pen down, picked it up. 3 seconds, bought clean. Lorraine was reading the repayment confirmation. She had told Darnell at the Dabney Road office that she had genuinely forgotten the repayment. He believed her on that, not entirely forgotten, but selectively. The structure of the story she had built for herself required forgetting the specific document while preserving the general feeling that the $47,000 had been foundational to something that had grown into something significant. She had misplaced the fact while keeping the emotional logic, which was entirely human. He watched her read until the moment when the forgetting became impossible. When the document, physical, dated, marked satisfied, made the alternative version of the story unavailable. Her hands were flat on the table. She did not move them. Fourth document. Invoice summary. Total billed, total paid, outstanding balance, counterclaim reference. The service agreement between Cooper Distribution Group and Mitchell Catering was a documented commercial arrangement between two separate legal entities. Your client signed it, renewed it annually. The services were rendered. The outstanding balance of $94,000 is a legitimate business receivable. Lewis, we've agreed to settlement at $61,000. Confirmed. Lorraine said nothing. The invoice summary was not a surprise. Jeffrey had prepared her. But there was a difference between being walked through a number in preparation and watching it placed on a table in a formal session as something that would appear in a decree. This room gave it a finality it hadn't had anywhere else. She looked at the summary, then looked at Darnell. He met her eyes. Not to communicate anything, not to press, just to be present for the moment. Because she was looking at him and looking away would have been its own kind of statement. After a moment, she looked back at the table. Fifth document. Federal contract summary. 3 procurement agreements. Annual revenue, $1.4 million recurring. Renewals through 2027. Lewis read it. Read it again. His binder had been prepared for a regional freight company with a few government clients. The document he was reading described an operation with federal procurement relationships representing nearly half of total annual revenue. The most stable, most renewable, most creditworthy category of income available to a private contractor. Lorraine had not known, not the scope, not the structure, not the renewal terms. She had known he had government clients. He had mentioned it once, the way he mentioned business facts that were relevant but didn't require elaboration. She had not asked a follow-up. He had not offered one. The look that moved across her face was not the look of someone who had been deceived. It was the look of someone who had not looked. Those were different things. Significantly different. And she was intelligent enough to know the difference in the moment she was living it. Neither she nor Lewis said anything. The document sat on the table and was what it was. Sixth document. Subleased agreement, short pump venue. 4 years, $840 a month. Tenant, Mitchell Catering LLC. Master lease, Broad Property Management LLC, subsidiary of Cooper Property Management Group LLC, sole member Darnell James Cooper. Your client has held this venue under commercial sublease for 4 consecutive years. Angela's voice was even, addressed to Lewis but available to the room. At an event held here last month, she asked my client to publicly demonstrate his commitment to the marriage or leave. The venue where she delivered that request has been generating rental income for my client's company for 4 consecutive years. She closed the folder. The sublease renewal is in 39 days. My client will not be extending it beyond the agreed 30-day extension. Lewis leaned toward Lorraine, spoke quietly and precisely. She listened without turning to him, Then she looked across at Darnell. The composure she had carried into the room was still present, but it had become something thinner, something carrying a weight it had not been built for. I built that business, her voice held. The steadiness was costing her something the room could see even if no one named it. I did the work, every event, every client call, every menu, every vendor negotiation. That was not nothing. That was real. Darnell looked at her steadily. It was real, he said, and then he said what the rest of the picture required. Not because he disputed what she had built, because the complete picture included the rest. You built a real business. I don't disagree with a word of that. But you built it with distribution infrastructure priced at internal rates, with vendor relationships that 2 of your 5 largest accounts traced back through my network. In a venue where your monthly check was paying rent to my company, he did not lean in or raise his voice, just spoke with the level of accuracy he brought to everything that required it. Those facts don't diminish what you built, but they define the limits of what you can claim against what I built in the 8 years before you knew my last name. He gathered his copies and placed them in his bag. You told me to beg or leave in a building I owned. I left. That was the only honest answer I had then. He stood. It's the same answer now. He walked out of the conference room, through the Grove Avenue lobby, through the front door and into the October morning, pale light, first real edge of cold. The city in the particular quiet it found when the season turned. The pickup was in the lot. He got in, hands on the wheel, engine off, not triumph, not relief. The feeling at the end of a long route when the last delivery is confirmed, and the truck is heading back to the dock, and every movement has landed in the right place. He started the engine, drove toward Dabney Road. Behind him in the conference room, Jeffrey Lewis was reviewing the repayment documentation with the focused attention of a man reorganizing what he understood about a case he had been preparing for 3 months. The folder Angela had assembled remained on the table, organized the way every inventory Darnell had ever conducted was organized. Every item in its right place, nothing missing, every movement accounted for from origin to destination. The dock would be at full pace by the time he arrived. The day was running on schedule. Darnell read the Victor Bryant report on a Tuesday morning at his desk on Dabney Road, coffee going cold on the coaster, which happened rarely, which told him something about the weight of what he was reading. Victor Bryant Restaurant Group. 1 location, Broad Street, 4 years in operation, supplier debt, $212,000 across 7 vendors, not 1 slow account, not 2. 7. The distribution of that debt told the real story, not a cash flow problem, not a timing issue, not the ordinary friction of a growing business, a structural failure. Revenue coming in below what the operation required to sustain itself, the gap serviced with credit that had been extended past the point where any of the creditors were willing to extend it further. Commercial lease, 90 days from triggering a formal default notice. The renewal had not been executed. The landlord's attorney had sent a written inquiry in August. Victor's management had responded with a payment plan. The payment plan was already behind, kitchen equipment financing, delinquent since February, cure notices in April and June, account not brought current after either. The website had professional photographs. The menu had the language of a place that understood its market. The reviews mentioned atmosphere, presentation, the way the dining room felt on a Friday night. Victor moved through it with the ease of a man whose operation was solid, table to table, conversation to conversation, the host who made every party of 4 feel anticipated. The outside was the only part that was working. Darnell set the report down. He did not feel what a simpler version of this situation might have called for. He had been in business long enough to understand that a struggling enterprise was not a moral condition. It was a structural one. Victor Bryant had built something that required a discipline different from the one he had. The discipline of appearances was a genuine skill, genuinely difficult to maintain, and it was not the skill that kept a lease current or serviced 7 supplier accounts. What he felt was the resigned clarity of a building inspector who had walked a property misrepresented in the listing. Nothing in the report surprised him. Every line confirmed what he had read in the way Victor occupied rooms, the performance of a man holding a position he was no longer financially qualified to fill, and Lorraine was using that performance as a measurement. She was making plans for her future against a man who was 90 days from a collapse she had no way of seeing from where she stood. That was her situation to encounter on its own schedule, not his to announce. Angela called that afternoon. The counterclaim has been filed. Randall received it this morning. He called my office twice before noon. Darnell waited. He's a capable attorney. He'll reassess his client's position. That's the process working the way it should. A shorter pause. I also identified something you should have the full picture on. He listened. 2 of Mitchell Catering's 5 largest accounts, representing approximately 35% of Lorraine's annual revenue, had come through introductions Darnell had made through Cooper Distribution's vendor network, not formal referrals with documentation. The ordinary movement of professional relationships in a connected industry. A hotel catering manager who trusted Darnell's company and whose confidence in Lorraine's operation had been shaped, in part, by the implicit weight of that introduction. A corporate event coordinator whose company used Cooper Distribution and whose early opinion of Mitchell Catering had been influenced by the relationship that had made the introduction possible. I'm not suggesting you use that information as leverage, Angela said. I know, I'm suggesting you understand the complete picture. He understood it. And he understood something Angela had not said. That those relationships were sustained by a professional gravity that existed because he was behind them. Not actively managed, not maintained through ongoing effort. Just present in the way that 15 years of accurate invoices and trucks running on time built the kind of standing that didn't need to announce itself because it had become part of how the industry operated around it. He set the phone down and looked at the routing ledger on his desk. His grandfather had kept the same discipline in the Hull Street warehouse. Handwritten, updated daily, not as backup or sentiment but as practice. The belief that understanding your own operation required writing it down in your own hand, often enough to feel the difference between a good week and a struggling one before the software confirmed it. Darnell had kept the practice through everything. He opened the ledger to a blank page, wrote one line, 55 days on the sublease, closed it. The week ran normally, which was the point. 5:15 at the dock every morning, clipboard, coffee, first truck through the gate at 5:22 or 5:24 depending on northwest traffic, dispatch board green by 7, mid-morning check-in with Terry Coleman, who had been with Cooper Distribution for 6 years, and who ran daily routing with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned the system from the ground up and understood why each element was where it was. Terry had been Darnell's most important internal decision, not because of charisma or obvious ambition, because of a quality of attention that was genuinely rare. He noticed things, minor load-weight discrepancies, route timing patterns that shifted by a few minutes over successive weeks in ways that pointed to conditions rather than chance. He reported what he observed without adding interpretation, which was the rarest thing a supervisor could consistently do. Darnell had promoted him to operations manager in March. The promotion had freed Darnell for the work he had been building toward for 2 years. Contract development, federal relationship management. The longer planning horizon that required the kind of patient attention that daily operations consumed rather than generated. He had spent 2 years cultivating a 4th federal relationship. Department of Defense Logistics Facility, northern part of the state. Regional Food Supply Chain Management. The proposal had been in review for 8 months. He checked the status that Wednesday. No update. Federal procurement moved at its own pace. Either the proposal was strong and the timeline was what it was, or there was a gap and someone would eventually identify it. Urgency was not a useful posture toward either outcome. He noted the check. Moved on. Lorraine called on a Thursday evening. Her voice carried a different texture than the Patterson Avenue dinner. Less performed ease, more actual uncertainty. The kind of uncertainty that appeared when a plan had encountered the specific friction of reality and the person holding the plan was no longer entirely confident in the terrain. She asked if they could speak. He said yes. She asked if they could meet. He said she could come by the office if she wanted, or they could schedule for the following week. A pause long enough to carry its own meaning. "I'll come by," she said. She arrived at the Dabney Road office at 6:30. The dock had settled by then. Last routes back, end-of-day inventory complete, Terry's handoff notes on the desk. The office had the smell of a workplace that was maintained without being decorated. Lorraine stood in the doorway and looked at the room with the expression of someone encountering something familiar through a frame that had shifted. She had been here before. The first 2 years of the marriage, when his office was a regular stop on his Friday schedule, and she would sometimes meet him here before dinner. She had sat in the chair across the desk and asked questions about how freight logistics worked. Not from professional interest, out of actual curiosity about how something she didn't understand operated. He had liked that about her. Present tense, past circumstance. He still liked it in the abstract. She sat across from him. Jeffrey says the counterclaim changes things significantly. That's accurate. The 47,000, she stopped. Reorganized. I didn't. I genuinely forgot about the repayment. I wasn't trying to. He waited. She stopped again. This time differently. Not strategy, not recalibration. The halt of a person who had started a sentence and arrived at a place where several honest things could be said and none of them were comfortable. I believed it was a contribution, she said. I know the document said loan, but I told myself a different version. I know, he said. That was harder to sit with than an accusation would have been. The quiet acknowledgement without condemnation required her to own what she had told herself without the relief of defending against a charge being leveled. She sat with it for a moment. What happens now? Angela and Jeffrey work through the remaining terms. The counterclaim gets resolved, the decree gets finalized, and the sublease. He said nothing. She nodded. The slow nod of someone confirming an answer they had already worked out, but needed to hear acknowledged. She stood, straightened her jacket. Said, not asking, not arguing, just setting something down that needed to be said before she left. I did build something real. Whatever else is true. I want you to know I know that. I know you know it, he said. She left. He sat in the quiet after her footsteps faded. Then opened the routing ledger and updated the Thursday column. Harold Reed called on a Saturday morning. Darnell was at the Westover Hills bungalow. On his knees in the main room with the pneumatic nailer, working from the east wall toward the back window, the hardwood advancing across the subfloor in the sequence he had mapped before he began. The satisfaction was physical and specific. Each board placed, the pattern building, the nailer's sound as the fastener seated correctly. Harold's name came across the screen. Gerald's lodge dinner was last night. Victor Bryant came up again. Harold's voice carried the flat economy he used when delivering information he had thought about before calling. Default notice on his lease came through officially. September 1st. Victor's been negotiating an extension, but the landlord's attorney isn't interested in another payment plan. 2 of the 7 supplier accounts have already referred the debt to collections. Gerald heard that directly. Darnell set the nailer down, leaned against the wall. 3 boards loose on the subfloor, waiting. How's Gerald's account? 90 days out with no resolution in sight. He's written it as a loss. The collections referrals were the part that couldn't be managed with presentation or deferred payments. Once they appeared on the business credit record, future financing became either impossible or prohibitively expensive. A food service operation with active supplier relationships had no runway without financing flexibility. Victor's restaurant was not struggling toward recovery. It was in the terminal sequence of a structural failure that had been running for longer than the surface had shown. Lorraine doesn't know any of this, Harold said. Not a question. No, she's going to, yes. On her own timeline. Harold was quiet for a moment. The background of his Chesterfield house came through. A television in another room, the particular stillness of a retired man's Saturday morning. Your grandmother used to say the hardest lesson wasn't learning to read people, he said. It was accepting you couldn't do the reading for them. A pause. The truck moves whether the cargo understands the route or not. Darnell said goodbye. Put the phone in his pocket, picked up the nailer, placed the next board, fired clean. The bungalow had been his since April. He had walked it in March with a contractor friend who confirmed the structural integrity and said the mechanic work was significant but manageable for someone with patience and the right tools. Darnell had drafted the renovation sequence on the back of a routing sheet that evening. Room by room, structural questions first, subfloor before hardwood, electrical before walls, kitchen before bathrooms, because the kitchen was what a house organized itself around. The kitchen cabinets had come first, built over 3 weekends in July. Dimensional lumber from the millwork supplier on Hull Street. Shaker profile, flush overlay. The joints cut with the precision of someone who understood that cabinetry either fit correctly or it didn't, and there was no middle condition. He had stained them with a sample he tested against the door in 3 different lights, choosing the one that read right. It wasn't until the second coat that he recognized the color, the same tone as the desk that had sat in his grandfather's Hull Street warehouse for 22 years. The desk that had been in climate-controlled storage in Southside since Elias died in 2015. He had not reconsidered the stain. The floors were into their 3rd weekend. Each board a completed unit, each row a visible record of the distance covered. He was 2/3 through the main room. Angela called Monday with an update. Lewis had come back with a revised position over the weekend. The equitable interest claim was withdrawn. He had reviewed the repayment documentation and reached the same conclusion Angela had anticipated he would. What remained was property division, spousal support, and counter-claim resolution. He wants to settle at 65. Your read? 61 is achievable. He knows the claim is solid and his client needs to resolve her liquidity position to fund the transition. A pause. She'll also need the sublease extension question addressed. She has events booked at the short pump venue through end of year. 39 days remained on the current lease. The renewal date is in 42 days, Darnell said. Yes, she has 42 days to make alternative arrangements. That is accurate. Angela's tone carried the neutrality of an attorney confirming fact without recommending position. I wanted you to have the full picture before the next session, he told her he did. They scheduled the next session for the following Thursday. He put the phone down and sat at the routing desk. The sublease decision was not cruelty. He had turned it over carefully enough to be certain of that. The space had been offered at market rate, renewed annually, administered through the normal property management process. Mitchell Catering had received 4 years of the same service any commercial tenant received. The fact that Darnell held the master lease had never been hidden. It was filed with the county, registered with the State Corporation Commission, available to anyone who looked. Lorraine had not looked. That was not his responsibility to compensate for. What was his to decide was what kind of man he intended to be in the resolution of this marriage. He had no interest in engineering difficulty for its own sake. He had no interest in watching her scramble toward a solution she didn't have time to find. But he also had no obligation to extend an arrangement that no longer made sense on either side of the table. He emailed his property management coordinator. Standard notification: short pump sublease would not be renewed at the expiration date. 42 days out, as the agreement required, he went back to the routing ledger and finished the week's entries. Here is what the nights were. Not dramatic. Not the kind where a man sat in the dark with something in a glass and constructed a narrative of grievance. Just the ordinary evenings when the work was done and the house was quiet. And there was nothing requiring his attention, and the quiet had a weight to it that working hours did not. The way an empty freight truck sounded different from a loaded one. Same chassis, same road, different cargo. You felt the difference before you could have explained it. He was not grieving the marriage the way grief was expected to arrive. Sudden, consuming, demanding immediate expression. He was processing it the way he processed everything. Each element as it surfaced in order at the pace it required. The coffee came first. He had started saying his preference aloud in the empty kitchen before making it. Black, no sugar. Said to no one. Said to the counter. Said to the morning dark before he drove to the dock. Which was irrational. He was making his own coffee. No one was going to get it wrong. But Lorraine had remembered correctly for 2 years without being reminded, as the simple practice of someone paying attention, and now that habit of being remembered had no counterpart. The routine persisted without the person who had made it meaningful. It was a small and specific grief. He did not enlarge it. He did not minimize it either. He said it aloud in the empty kitchen and made the coffee and drove to Dabney Road, and that was the whole of what it required. Harold called on a Wednesday evening. Not about the proceedings, not about Victor, just to talk. Harold picked up on the second ring, which was his habit, and they spent 40 minutes on things that required no resolution. Harold's engine rebuild on the 1971 Ford, now in its third year and recently arrived at the point of actual progress. The Lodge Fall Fundraiser Planning Committee, which had generated the specific organizational frustration produced exclusively by groups of volunteers with no shared authority. Richmond in late September. Warm days, cold nights. The leaves beginning their first turn along the James. Darnell talked, and found that conversation without strategic weight was its own kind of relief. The way a man who had been carrying something all day felt when he set it down, not because the carrying had been wrong, just because setting it down reminded him that movement without it was possible. Near the end, Harold said, "You eating right?" "Yes." "Sleeping?" "Mostly good." A pause. "Your grandfather used to say a man who doesn't eat and sleep is trying to run a truck without fuel. You can get a little ways on fumes." "Not far," Darnell said he understood. He did. The Thursday before the mediation, he came to the dock in the pre-dawn dark and set the clipboard back on its hook inside the door and walked out without it. Not as statement, not as symbolism, because there was a form of presence that instruments served and a form that they didn't, and this particular morning called for the second form, diesel, cold air, the partial dark of an October pre-dawn in central Virginia, the eastern sky showing the first thin edge of change. He stood near the second bay door and thought about the mediation the way he thought through any complex sequence before beginning. The mental walkthrough of a route, stops confirmed in order, load verified before the truck left the dock. The documentation was in position. The counterclaim was filed. The sublease notification had been sent. Angela had prepared the presentation sequence. Every element that could be ready was ready. And he thought about Lorraine, with more honesty than he had allowed himself since the dinner. Not the Lorraine of the last several months. The one who had used the word reasonable twice in one sentence and performed cooperative pragmatism across a table on Patterson Avenue. The earlier one. The one who had sat in the chair across his desk on Friday evenings and asked questions about freight logistics out of genuine interest. The one who had made his coffee correctly for 2 years without once having to check. What had happened to that person was not difficult to trace. She had needed to be seen, in a way that Darnell had not provided and had not understood she needed. Publicly, professionally, in the register of the Richmond food service community she had built her business inside. She had needed her husband to exist in that register with her, to show up in the right rooms and be known and reflect back, through the eyes of the people whose opinions she valued, that what she was building was worth being seen building. Darnell had not done that, not because it was beyond him, because it had not occurred to him to try. He had been so certain that the structure of their shared life, the company, the contracts, the financial foundation, was sufficient evidence of commitment that he had not considered a person who never complained about the structure might be going hungry inside of it. He had been present in every practical sense of the word, and absent in that required no system, no clipboard, just the willingness to look at someone and ask what they needed that he wasn't providing. That was not the only story of the marriage. It was not the story that justified what she had done. But it was a real part of the story, and he gave it the full weight it deserved. He had loved her. He had also failed her in a specific way that belonged to him and no one else. Both were true. Neither cancelled the other. He held them both. Then the first truck came through the gate at 5:23, and the day's sequence began, and Darnell Cooper stepped back into the operational current he had built and let the morning run. The night before the mediation, he worked the bungalow floors until 9:30. The final third of the main room, the section nearest the back wall, required individual measurement for every board. Old houses settled unevenly over 80 years, and the wall that looked straight from across the room deviated from plumb by a 1/4 inch over 12 feet. That deviation meant no board in the final run could be cut to a standard dimension. Each one had to be measured against the actual condition of the wall it was fitting to. He cut at the miter saw in the backyard, carried each board inside, test fit against the baseboard, adjusted, nailed. He cleaned up at 9:30, made dinner at the kitchen counter, the table still covered in renovation materials, nothing set for sitting, ate standing. Went to bed at 10:15 and slept through the night without interruption, which was what happened when the day had been fully used. Angela called at 6:50 the next morning. Randall is requesting a brief pre-session conference before we begin. He wants to address the counterclaim settlement number before the formal session starts. Your read? He's had a conversation with his client about the strength of our position, and she's agreed to move. A pause. He mentioned 62. What do you recommend? 61. I think he comes down one more. If he doesn't, 62 is within acceptable range. 61, a shorter pause. He also wants to know whether the sublease decision is negotiable. The answer had been made. It isn't, Darnell said. That's what I expected. I'll see you at 9. He put the phone down, picked up his coffee, stood at the window of the north side rental, the bungalow not yet livable, and looked at the street in the early morning light. The trees on the block were changing, yellow moving in from the leaf edges, the green retreating toward center the way it always did in October. He drank the coffee, got in the truck, drove to Grove Avenue. The pre-session lasted 9 minutes. Lewis arrived with a revised counterclaim figure, 61.5. Angela counted at 61 flat. Lewis conferred by phone, Lorraine, waiting somewhere else in the building. Came back, 61. Angela looked at Darnell. He nodded. Lewis wrote it down, the sublease. He set his pen on the table. My client has 4 events booked at Short Pump between now and mid-December. She's requesting 60 days to allow for transition. 39 days remained on the current lease. 30 days, Darnell said. If she can complete her December bookings within 30 additional days, the extension is available at standard rate. Lewis wrote it without arguing, which meant he had expected a harder refusal. The pre-session ended. They moved to the conference room, morning light through the east-facing window, hitting the table surface at an angle that made the wood grain visible, almost too physical for a room where paper arguments were about to be made. Darnell noted it, moved on. Lorraine was already seated. Dark blue blazer, white shirt, not the gray suit she wore to events requiring authority. This was steadiness. A different calculation about how to appear in this room, executed precisely. She did not look at him when they came in. He sat across from her and waited. Lewis had a reorganized binder open to a tabbed page, significantly thinner than the version Darnell had seen before, the equity interest section removed. He looked at the remaining papers with the focused calm of a professional who had absorbed a significant overnight revision to his understanding and arrived prepared to work with what was left. Angela placed the folder on the table. First document went down at 9:14, formation filing, Virginia State Corporation Commission. September 14, 2007. Sole proprietor, Darnell James Cooper. Converted to LLC 2011, sole member remaining, Darnell James Cooper. 8 years and 4 months before the marriage certificate, which Angela placed beside it so the proximity could do the work that argument didn't need to. Lewis read both. Second document. Promissory note. 2008, lender, Lorraine Ann Mitchell, $47,000. Standard terms clearly stated. Third document, repayment confirmation. Full amount, marked satisfied. 11 months before the wedding, Angela let the 3 sit together. The founding financial contribution your client described as an investment was a documented loan, repaid in full before the marriage that would have needed to exist for the investment theory to have any merit. Lewis set his pen down, picked it up again. The emotion of a professional buying himself exactly the seconds he needed. Lorraine was reading the repayment confirmation. She had told Darnell at the Dabney Road office that she had genuinely forgotten the repayment. He believed her not entirely, because the structure of the story she had built required a selective forgetting, the kind that preserved the emotional logic while misplacing the specific document. She had forgotten the fact while keeping the feeling that the $47,000 had been foundational to something that had grown into something real, which was a recognizably human thing to do. He watched her read until the moment when the forgetting became unavailable, when the document, physical, dated, marked satisfied, made the alternative version of the story impossible to maintain. Her hands were flat on the table. She did not move them. Fourth document, invoice summary. Angela walked it through with the efficient clarity of someone presenting arithmetic rather than argument. 4 years of services rendered at internal rates. Outstanding balance, $94,000. Counterclaim filed and attached. The service agreement between Cooper Distribution Group and Mitchell Catering was a documented commercial arrangement between two separate legal entities. Your client signed it and renewed it annually. The services were rendered. The outstanding balance represents a legitimate business receivable. Lewis. We've agreed to settlement at $61,000. Confirmed. Lorraine said nothing. The invoice summary was not a surprise. Lewis had prepared her. But preparation and presence were different conditions. And in this room, with the document on the table as something that would appear in a decree, the number carried a finality it had not carried in any conversation before this. She looked at the summary, then looked at Darnell. He met her eyes, not to communicate anything, not to press or reassure or signal, just to be present for the moment, because she was looking at him and looking away would have been its own kind of message. After a moment, she looked back at the documents. Fifth document, Federal Contract Summary. 3 procurement agreements. Annual revenue, $1.4 million. Recurring. Renewals is extending through 2027. Lewis read it. Read it again. His binder had been built around a regional freight operation with modest government exposure. The document in front of him described an entity with federal procurement relationships representing nearly half of total annual revenue. The most stable, most renewable, most credit-worthy category of private business income that existed. Lorraine had not known the scale. She had known he had government clients. He had mentioned it once, the way he mentioned business facts that were relevant but didn't need elaboration. She had not asked a follow-up. He had not offered one. The look that moved across her face was not the look of someone who had been kept from information. It was the look of someone who had not asked. Those were different things, meaningfully different. And she was intelligent enough to understand the difference in the moment she was inhabiting. Neither she nor Lewis said anything. The document sat on the table and was what it was. Sixth document, the subleasee agreement. Short pump venue, 4 years, $840 a month. Tenant Mitchell Catering LLC Master Lease, Broad Property Management LLC subsidiary of Cooper Property Management Group LLC, sole member Darnell James Cooper. Your client has held this venue under commercial sublease for 4 consecutive years. Angela looked at Lewis but spoke for the room. At an event held here last month, she asked my client to publicly demonstrate his commitment to the marriage or leave. The venue where she made that request has been generating rental income for my client's company for 4 consecutive years. She closed the folder. The sublease will not be renewed beyond the agreed 30-day extension. Lewis leaned toward Lorraine, spoke in a low, precise voice. She listened without turning toward him. Her eyes were on the documents arranged across the center of the table. Then she looked up at Darnell. The composure she had carried into the room was still present. But it had become something different, thinner, carrying a weight it had not been built for. I built that business. Her voice held. The steadiness was costing her something the room could measure even if no one named it. I did every piece of the work, every client call, every menu, every vendor negotiation, every early morning in every venue. That was not nothing. That was real. Darnell looked at her steadily. It was real, he said. Then he said what the rest of the picture required. Not to dispute what she had built, to make the complete picture available. You built a real business. I don't disagree with a word of that. But you built it using distribution infrastructure at below market rates. With vendor relationships that 2 of your 5 largest accounts traced back through my network. In a venue where the rent check was coming to my company every month, he did not lean in, did not raise his voice, spoke with the same level accuracy he brought to everything that required it. Those facts don't reduce what you built, but they define the edges of what you can claim against what I built in the 8 years before you knew my last name. He gathered his copies and placed them in his bag. You told me to beg or leave in a building I owned. I left. That was the only honest answer I had. He stood. It's the same answer now. He walked out of the conference room, through the Grove Avenue lobby, and into the October morning. Pale light, the first real cold, the city in the particular quiet it found when the season shifted and everything adjusted to a different register. The pickup was in the lot. He got in, sat with his hands on the wheel, engine off, not triumph, not relief. The feeling at the end of a long route when the last delivery has confirmed and the truck is heading back to the dock and every movement has landed in the right place. Something settled, carried differently than it had been. He started the engine, drove toward Dabney Road. Behind him in Angela's conference room, Jeffrey Lewis was reviewing the repayment documentation with the focused attention of a man reorganizing what he understood about a case he had been building for 3 months. The folder Angela had assembled remained on the table, organized the way every inventory Darnell had ever conducted was organized. Every item in its right place, every movement accounted for from origin to destination. The dock would be at full operational pace by the time he arrived. The day was running on schedule. Terry Coleman called while Darnell was pulling onto the highway. Third truck on the northwest route came back with a timing issue. Patterson Road stop has been running 7 minutes long 3 days in a row. I'm thinking dock configuration on the client's end. Pull their contact and reach out. Don't wait for them to flag it. Already pulled it. Wanted to confirm the approach before calling. Call on it. Darnell put the phone in the cup holder and settled into the drive. The sequence of exits he knew by memory. The point where the highway widened. The interchange that smelled like the distribution plant running 24 hours 2 miles east. He drove toward the dock, toward the afternoon's operational review with Terry, toward the work the way he had always driven. Not away from anything, toward what came next. That evening he went back to the bungalow, not to work. He had the floors to finish, but he had told himself he was not finishing them tonight. He drove over after the dock because he wanted to see the room in the evening light, which was a thing he had started doing without deciding to. Stopping by to see where the work stood, the way you checked on something you were building to confirm it, was becoming what it was meant to be. He stood in the main room with the 3/4 laid floor, and the kitchen visible through the doorway, and the last light of the day going orange through the windows at the back of the house. The room had the particular quiet of a structure that was becoming itself, not finished, but clearly going to be right. He looked at the section that remained, 2 weekends, maybe 3 if the wall runs required more custom cuts than he was anticipating. He stood there until the light was gone, then he drove back to the north side rental, made dinner, ate it, went to bed, somewhere in the northern part of the state, in a procurement office at a federal logistics facility. A proposal that had been in review for 8 months was approaching the point in the review cycle where decisions were made. He did not know when. He knew the route was right. That was sufficient. The decree was finalized on a Friday. Not dramatic. Not cinematic the way the short pump dinner had been cinematic. Just a document that arrived in Angela's office at 11 in the morning, signed by a judge in Richmond Circuit Court, and became the legal record of something that had actually ended 3 weeks earlier in a conference room on Grove Avenue. Angela called with the confirmation. It's done. Clean. No outstanding items. Darnell was at the dock when the call came, standing near the second bay door with the afternoon's last routing report in his hand. Morning routes had completed. Terry had done the end-of-day handoff and gone home. The building held the quiet it kept in late afternoon. Not empty. The overnight prep crew would arrive at 9, but resting between the day's work and the night's preparation. Thank you, he said. You handled the process correctly. Angela paused. Not for effect. Just the pause of someone who had been doing this for 25 years and understood that the end of a legal proceeding and the end of what the proceeding had been about were different events on different timelines. Give yourself some time. The work was right. What comes after works at its own pace, he said he understood, he did. He stood at the dock for a few minutes after the call ended, not reviewing the session, not calculating the next step. Just standing in the late afternoon quiet of a space he had built from a leased unit and 2 temperamental trucks into something that employed 11 people and held federal contracts and had a handwritten ledger on the desk that was into its 4th volume. Then he went to the office, updated the routing ledger for the week, reviewed Terry's handoff notes, sent 2 emails, drove to the bungalow. The final third of the main room floor took 2 full Saturdays and most of a Sunday. Every board in the back wall run required individual measurement. Old houses settled unevenly over 8 decades. and the wall that appeared straight from across the room deviated from plumb by a quarter inch over 12 feet. That deviation, invisible unless you were fitting boards against it, meant nothing could be cut to a repeating dimension. Each piece had to be measured against the actual wall, cut at the miter saw in the backyard, carried inside, test fit, adjusted, nailed. He worked through both Saturdays without rushing. The second Sunday, he laid the final board, 7 inches wide, running the full length of the back wall, seated precisely against the baseboard he had refinished in August. He sat back on his heels and looked at the room, full floor, east to west, the grain running in a continuous line from the front door threshold to the back wall. The color warm in the way old hardwood went warm under afternoon light, not the yellow warmth of new wood, but the deeper tone of something that had been worked and was now settled. It looked like it had always been there. That was the point. He cleaned up without hurrying, swept the floor with the broom he had bought specifically for hardwood, gathered the offcuts from the wall runs, rolled the miter saw back to the garage on its base. Then he stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the main room and looked at the two rooms together, the cabinets he had built in July, the floor he'd just finished, the late October light moving through both spaces at the angle that the house had been designed to catch. He made coffee in the kitchen and stood at the counter and drank it in the quiet of rooms that had become what they were supposed to be. He had made the right purchase, not just by the numbers, the renovation costs within the budget he had set, the projected value strong given how the neighborhood was moving. Right in the prior sense. Right for this version of his life, this point in the sequence of things he was building. Some things you knew before you could prove them. November moved with the momentum of a month that understood it was a passage. The days shortened fast. The trees along the James completed their turn and began to drop. Richmond went quieter in November, not withdrawn, just calibrated to a lower register, the way cities did when the warmth went and the outdoor life pulled inside. At Cooper Distribution, Terry Coleman had assumed full daily routing supervision with the confidence of someone who had been ready for the responsibility before it was formally assigned. The transition had been so clean that Darnell had barely felt the shift. Not the sensation of handing something off, but the natural settling of a configuration that fit. The system running the way a system was supposed to run when it had been built correctly. This freed Darnell for the work he had been building toward. Contract development, federal relationship management. The longer planning horizon that required the kind of patient attention that daily operations consumed rather than generated. He spent 3 days in Washington in mid-November, not for a specific meeting, for the category of presence that federal procurement relationships required. His agency events, conference sessions, the professional visibility that operated on long timelines and produced results that didn't announce themselves until they arrived fully formed. He stayed near the Capitol Hill district, ate dinner alone both evenings at a restaurant where the food was good and the room was quiet enough for the kind of thinking that had no specific object. He worked on contract development material in the mornings, not from urgency but from discipline. The kind of work that built in layers and required consistent attention to build at all. The DOD proposal was still in review. He had spoken with Patricia Johnson, the procurement officer who ran regional contracting for the Northern Virginia facility, the week before the Washington trip. She had communicated with the precision of someone who had been managing federal relationships for 20 years and understood exactly how much information was appropriate to share at each stage. "You're in the last group," she had said. "I can't tell you more than that. That's enough," he had said. And it was. Final comparison meant the proposal had cleared every prior stage. The question was no longer whether it qualified. It was whether it was the right choice among qualified options. He trusted the proposal. He had built it the way he built everything, starting with what the work actually required, not what he hoped would be sufficient, and being honest when a section needed more than he had initially given it. He returned from Washington on a Thursday evening. The bungalow was ready to live in. He moved that weekend. Moving into the Westover Hills house was not a complicated event. He did not carry the accumulation that marriages produced. Furniture chosen together, kitchen equipment gathered over years of shared cooking, the objects that accreted around a shared life. The decree had addressed the marital home, the jointly purchased furniture, the shared accounts. What Darnell took from that process was what he had brought into it: the routing ledger collection, the tools, the professional reference books that filled 2 shelves in whatever room he was using as an office. And his grandfather's desk. The desk had been in a climate-controlled storage unit in Southside since Elias Cooper died in 2015. Darnell had moved it from the Hull Street warehouse the week after the funeral and had paid the monthly storage fee for 8 years without settling what to do with it. The piece was substantial, 6 feet wide, solid oak, built by someone in the 1950s who believed furniture should outlast the person using it. Too large for the Beechwood house, too significant to auction. He had known, somewhere in the back of the planning, that the 2nd bedroom of the Westover Hills bungalow had been sized correctly for it. He rented a truck on Saturday morning and drove to Southside. A neighbor was waiting outside the storage facility when he arrived. A man from the block who had heard through Harold that Darnell was moving the family desk and had come without being asked, the way things happened in that part of Southside when word moved through the right channels. They loaded the desk together. Drove to Westover Hills. The desk fit in the 2nd bedroom exactly, not approximately. The way things fit when you had measured correctly, and the room had been built by someone who understood proportion. Darnell stood in the doorway of the 2nd bedroom and looked at his grandfather's desk under the new light of the bungalow, the lamp he had set up before moving anything else, because the desk needed to be seen in proper light before he knew if the room was right. It was right. The surface still carried 40 years of use in its marks. The places where the leather desk pad had ended and the oak had taken the impression of decades of handwritten work. The right side drawer still had the small brass bulls that Elias had replaced twice, because he believed hardware should fit properly in the hand, and the original pull had been slightly wrong. Darnell sat in the chair he had brought from the North Side rental and put both hands flat on the surface. He said, out loud, to the empty room, "4th contract is coming." He did not know exactly why he said it at that moment, only that the room was right and the desk was in it, and it felt like the thing to say to the right absence. December, the city strung its lights. The James went gray and quick with early winter rain. The distribution center on Dabney Road entered the busiest seasonal stretch. Food service demand through the holiday event season meant Cooper Distribution ran additional route days in both November and December to handle the volume increase. Terry managed the surge with the methodical focus he brought to all operational problems. Darnell watched from the contract development position he had settled into, present for the strategic decisions, available when Terry needed a second judgment, but no longer the primary operational center of the daily work. He still came in at 5:15 most mornings, but now he came with coffee and without the clipboard, stood near the 2nd bay door for 20 minutes, and watched the operation run on its own. Watching a system function without him as its daily anchor was not loss. It was what the system was supposed to do when it had been built correctly, run independently of any single person's constant supervision. His grandfather had always been clear on this. The measure of a well-built operation was not how it performed when the founder was present. It was how it performed on an ordinary Tuesday in December when the founder was building the next thing somewhere else. Cooper Distribution performed well on Tuesday mornings in December. Darnell was, on most of those Tuesdays, somewhere else. The call from Patricia Johnson came on a Wednesday afternoon at 2:17. He was at the bungalow, not working. He had taken the afternoon to hang the interior doors that had been temporarily removed during the floor refinishing. Main room door, bedroom door, the bathroom door that required adjusting the hinge mortises because the frame had shifted slightly during the work. He was on his knees with a chisel when the phone rang. Patricia Johnson, Northern Virginia. He put the chisel down. "Stood up, Mr. Cooper." Her voice carried the evenness of a federal procurement officer delivering a formal decision. Not cold, not warm, precise. "I'm calling to advise you that your proposal for regional food supply chain management services has been selected." He did not say anything for a moment. "The contract vehicle is being prepared. You'll receive formal documentation within 10 business days. "Thank you," he said. "Your operational plan was the differentiating factor, specifically the contingency routing structure. The committee found it more thoroughly developed than the competing proposals." He said he appreciated her telling him that. She said the documentation would follow. They ended the call with the efficiency of two professionals who had been working toward this across 8 months and understood that the result did not require ceremony. He put the phone in his pocket, stood in the hallway of the Westover Hills bungalow with the chiseled hinge mortise at his feet and the door leaning against the wall and the afternoon light coming through the refinished window at the end of the hall. Fourth contract. Department of Defense. Regional Food Supply Chain Management. Northern Virginia Logistics Facility. Annual revenue that would bring Cooper Distribution's total federal income to just under $2 million. 2 years of relationship development. 8 months of proposal review. The contingency routing section that he had rebuilt from the ground up after losing the first Woodbridge cycle and understanding exactly where the gap had been. He picked up his phone and called Harold. Second ring. Harold's unhurried weekday voice. Fourth contract, Darnell said. Silence on the line. Not the silence of someone who hadn't heard. The silence of a man taking a moment to receive what he had just been told before responding to it. Your grandfather would have liked this. Not would love. Would have liked. Harold's precision with tense. Elias was 9 years gone, and Harold did not use language that pretended otherwise. I know. Darnell said. How long you been working on it? 8 months on the proposal. 2 years on the relationship before that. A sound from Harold's end, the slow nod translated into breath. That's how you build federal. You don't rush federal. No, come for dinner Sunday. I'm making the ribs. He said he would. They hung up. He picked up the chisel, went back to the hinge mortise, finished the door. The Richmond food service community was a network in the structural sense. Not the social performance version of the word, but the actual weave of relationships and referrals and shared vendor histories and professional reputations that determined how business moved through the industry. Darnell had been part of it for 15 years. Not visibly, not in the way Lorraine had been part of it. The events, the mixer circuit, the presence at the tables where names were made. He had been part of it in the way that trucks running on time and invoices being accurate, and service agreements being honored exactly as written built, over 15 years. A professional standing that did not require maintenance because it had become foundational. In the months after the decree, he understood that some of what had happened in the marriage was related to this distinction. The visible part of the network, the events, the recognition, the name in the right rooms, was what Lorraine had built toward and had needed Darnell to participate in. He had consistently failed to see that as necessary. He had assumed the structural standing was its own sufficient statement, that the trucks running on time communicated what needed to be communicated. It did, just not to her, not in the way she had needed. He thought about this not with renewed guilt. He had settled that account at the dock in October, and it stayed settled, but with the practical understanding of a man who had learned something real about a gap he had not previously known existed. The lesson was not that building structurally had been wrong. The lesson was that a structure required more than the elements that carried the load. It also required walls, light, the things that made it livable rather than merely sound. He was building those into the bungalow. He was building them, slowly and without announcing it to himself, into the version of himself that lived on the other side of this year. Mitchell Catering's transition away from the short pump venue happened on the compressed timeline that was the consequence of the 30-day extension. He knew this not from direct contact, but from the ordinary information flow of a connected industry. A property manager who handled several event spaces mentioned in passing that a downtown hotel's event room had fielded a significant increase in catering inquiries through November. A food service vendor who worked with both his company and several catering operations referenced a client transition he had helped facilitate without naming names. Lorraine was managing it. The per-unit cost increase, moving from Cooper Distribution's internal rates to a standard commercial vendor, had shown up in her fourth quarter numbers in a way that required restructuring. He knew the approximate impact because he knew the rate differential and her approximate volume. 22% increase in distribution costs, absorbed across every event. 2 anchor accounts had shifted vendor relationships by mid-November. Natural movement, the kind that happened when the professional gravity sustaining a relationship was no longer active. Not a campaign, not an engineered result. Just the ordinary physics of a network where relationships required ongoing maintenance and the person who had made the introductions was no longer present to provide it. He registered this without anything attached to it, not satisfaction, not regret. Just the acknowledgement of a predictable consequence, recorded as it arrived, what he actually felt. And he named feelings the way he named everything, accurately rather than managing them into something easier, was something quieter than either. A muted sadness, not for himself. For the version of a catering operation that had been working well when it had access to infrastructure it no longer had. Lorraine was good at the work. She had built something real from a borrowed kitchen and a cargo van. The reality was now harder. He hoped she found the way through it. He meant that without qualification, Victor Bryant's restaurant on Broad Street closed the second week of August. Darnell heard it from Harold first, then from a mutual contact in the food distribution community, who mentioned it with the matter-of-fact brevity the industry used for closures that had been anticipated. The supplier debt had been the terminal event, not the only structural problem, but when the 2 vendors who had referred to collections moved to formal recovery, the business credit position became unworkable. The commercial lease default followed within weeks. The closing notice went on the door on a Tuesday. Victor had vacated the Broad Street space by the end of August. By September, he had relocated to Northern Virginia. A mutual acquaintance mentioned it at an industry event in October. Said Victor had taken a front-of-house management role at a restaurant group in Fairfax, which was a reasonable landing for a man who had spent 4 years developing the visible skills of restaurant operation, even if the structural ones had not held. Darnell said he was sorry to hear about the closure. He meant it in the uncomplicated way he meant things. A business closing was a business closing. The work that had gone into it, whatever proportion had been genuine, whatever proportion had been performance, was gone. That was worth being sorry about, regardless of the circumstances that surrounded it. Victor Bryant had not been a villain in this story. He had been a man who built a structure that looked sound from the outside and spent 4 years maintaining that appearance with real skill, while the interior accumulated failures he could not manage through presentation alone. That was not a moral failing, it was a structural one. Darnell had spent 15 years learning the difference between those 2 categories, and he could not hold a structural failure against someone who hadn't yet learned the same distinction. He hoped the Fairfax position gave Victor the time and the conditions to learn it. Here was the thing about recovery. It did not happen in a single identifiable moment. That was the version the story wanted to tell. The clean break, the deep breath, the morning when everything felt different. But that was not how it worked. It happened in accumulation. The first morning he made coffee without saying his preference aloud, because the habit had released without announcement. The evening he worked on the floors until 9 without thinking about anything except the boards and the wall and the next board. The first Tuesday in November when he drove to the dock in the pre-dawn dark, and the darkness felt like early morning rather than something else. Small, quiet, almost invisible, which was, when he thought about it, consistent with how he had always built things. The procurement conference in Arlington was a 2-day event in early June, 8 months after the decree. Patricia Johnson had mentioned it as a venue where several contracting officers he had been developing relationships with would be presenting. He flew up on a Wednesday morning. The conference was held in a hotel near the Pentagon City Metro. Multiple tracks running simultaneously. The organized momentum of a federal procurement event where everyone in the room was there because being there produced value. He attended a morning panel on regional supply chain management. 2 contracting officers from agencies he had been monitoring for future proposals. The discussion was substantive, the kind of specific operational conversation that made these events worth the time, not the generic programming that filled conference schedules to satisfy attendance requirements. And in the middle of the session, from 3 seats to his left, A woman asked a question that stopped the room. Not loudly. She raised her hand, was acknowledged by the moderator, and asked about contingency routing protocols in multi-agency supply agreements, with a precision that was targeted exactly at the operational gap the panelists had been circling for 20 minutes without entering. Two of the three panelists paused before answering. The third said, "That's the right question." Darnell turned Vanessa Carter. 40 years old, he would learn later. Federal agency. Contract specialist. She was writing in a small notebook. Not a laptop, a notebook, which told him something specific about how she processed what she heard. After the panel ended, he walked over. "That was the right question," he said. She looked up. Assessed him with the direct efficiency of someone who attended these events professionally and had learned to sort signal from noise quickly. They'd been building to it for 40 minutes without asking it. "I noticed. You're in supply chain, distribution, federal contracts," she nodded. Not impressed, she was past the point where titles produced impressions, but interested in a different way. "Which agencies?" He listed them. "I manage contracting for the DoD facility in Woodbridge," she said. He recognized it immediately. Adjacent to the Northern Virginia logistics network he had just contracted into through the 4th Federal Agreement. "I know the facility," he said. "I know your company. We reviewed your proposal last cycle. You came in second. There was another cycle, he knew. The current contract covered the Northern facility. Woodbridge was a separate facility, separate contracting process, separate cycle. When does the next cycle open?" he said. 6 months. And the contingency routing section was the weakness in your Woodbridge proposal. We used it as a case study internally. What we wished we'd seen. He looked at her. "I'd find that feedback useful, I know you would." She picked up the notebook. "I'm presenting at 2:30. If you're staying for the afternoon, the feedback takes about 20 minutes and would be more useful to you than whatever else is on the program." He was staying for the afternoon. "I'll be there," he said. She walked away toward the registration area without looking back. Not dismissal, just the directed movement of a person whose time was organized and who knew exactly where the next 10 minutes needed to go. Darnell stood at the edge of the emptying panel room and felt, for the first time in months, the specific alertness of a man who had encountered something he had not been anticipating and was paying full attention to what it was. The 20-minute feedback session ran to 2 hours and 15 minutes. They found a corner table in the conference hotel's atrium restaurant after her 2:30 presentation. A presentation that had been, from the 40 minutes Darnell attended, one of the 2 or 3 genuinely useful sessions of the conference. She stripped everything to structural logic. No narrative padding, no performance for audience engagement. Just the actual architecture of what she was describing, presented in sequence, with the implications made explicit without being overstated. He had asked a question from the floor. She had answered it with the same precision she brought to everything else, and made a note in the small notebook. In the atrium restaurant, she opened to that page and showed him, his question paraphrased in 3 words. A circled annotation, "Follow up." "You circled it," he said. "Questions that require follow-up get circled." She closed the notebook. "Yours required follow-up?" They covered the Woodbridge proposal for the first 40 minutes. She was specific and direct. The contingency routing section had been underdeveloped relative to the operational plan, which had been strong. The committee had wanted the contingency protocols as thoroughly specified as the primary routes. They had not found that in his proposal. They had found it in the one that was selected. He listened without defending, because she was right. He had known the contingency section was his weaker area when he submitted and had submitted it anyway, calculating that the primary plan was strong enough to carry it. That calculation had been wrong. He could see it clearly now, in the specific light of her feedback. "When I resubmit," he said, "the contingency section will be the strongest part." She looked at him. "When you resubmit, yes? Not if? Not if?" She considered him for a moment, the assessment of a woman who spent her professional life evaluating proposals and had learned to read the difference between the confidence that came from not understanding the competition and the confidence that came from understanding it clearly and choosing to move forward anyway. "Okay," she said, and then, because the Woodbridge proposal was covered and neither of them had moved to leave, The conversation shifted, not by decision. The way conversations moved when two people with organized minds found themselves in the same place, and the professional context had already established enough common ground that directness was available without requiring effort. She was originally from Richmond, had moved to the DC area for the federal position 12 years ago. Her grandmother had run a seamstress business in Jackson Ward, a one-woman operation that Vanessa had spent weekends inside as a child, watching her grandmother manage orders and clients and the economics of a business built on 2 decades of earned reputation. She kept a handwritten ledger, Vanessa said. Darnell set his coffee down. Every order, every payment, every client's preferences, fabric, measurements, whether they paid on time. She looked at him. She said the ledger was the business. Everything else was execution, he said. My grandfather said something like that. About freight. She looked at him with the attention of someone who had just heard a sentence confirm something she had been quietly running for 2 hours. What did he say? He told her. The line about moving things quietly. The ledger through 3 software migrations. The Hull Street warehouse and the 22 years. She was quiet for a moment. That's why the operational plan section was as strong as it was. That wasn't proposal writing. That was someone who actually runs the routes. There's no other way to write it, he said. The Atrium restaurant closed around them at 10 o'clock. They were still at the table. He flew back to Richmond Thursday morning. 40 minutes. He spent the flight looking at the Virginia landscape below. Winter fields and bare tree lines, and the James River running silver through the Piedmont, visible for 30 seconds before the flight path took it away. Vanessa Carter's number was in his phone. She had written it in the small notebook at the hotel entrance and torn the page out with the clean precision of someone who did not make gestures they did not intend. For the proposal questions, she had said, yes, he had said, neither of them had said anything else. He did not call Thursday or Friday. He spent Thursday at the dock with Terry and Friday, beginning the first section of the revised Woodbridge contingency protocols. The part of the proposal that would be, as he had said, the strongest section. He had already started rethinking it on the flight home. He called her Tuesday. Not because Tuesday was calculated. Because Tuesday was when he was ready, when he had processed the conference, the feedback, the conversation that had run 2 hours past its stated purpose, and felt clear about what he wanted to say. She answered on the 3rd ring. Cooper Distribution, she said. Not a question, yes. I was wondering when you'd call. A pause. Not coy. She was not a coy person. Honest, the contingency section? Among other things. A brief silence. Among other things, she repeated. I have a question, he said. That isn't about the proposal, I know, she said. They talked for 1 hour and 15 minutes. About Richmond in winter and what it looked like when the James went quiet in February. About the federal procurement calendar, which they both knew the way people knew systems they had organized their professional lives around. About her grandmother's ledger, now in a glass case in her Arlington apartment. The pages too fragile to open regularly, but the cover still legible with the business name in her grandmother's handwriting. About his grandfather's desk in the 2nd bedroom of a 1940s bungalow 3 blocks from the James River. Moved from 8 years of storage into the room that had been sized for it. You knew it would fit, Vanessa said. I measured, of course you did. He heard something in her voice. Not mockery, its opposite. The recognition of one person who operated by measurement encountering another who did the same, and understanding immediately what that meant. I'm coming to Richmond in February, she said. There's an event at the convention center I'm presenting at. Send me the dates, he said. She did that evening along with a single line. The contingency section in your next proposal should include 3 scenario-specific protocols, not 2. I'll explain in February. He read it twice, sent back. I'll have questions ready. Her response came 40 seconds later. Just good. He set the phone down on the surface of his grandfather's desk and looked at the 2nd bedroom, the desk under the lamp, the 4 volumes of the routing ledger on the shelf in sequence, the window, looking out to the backyard where the mitre saw had lived on its rolling base through the fall and early winter. Some things you built toward without knowing exactly what you were building toward. You started with what the work required. You did not skip steps. You trusted the measurements. And one day you stood in a doorway and looked at what you had built and understood that this was it. Not because you had planned every element, but because you had built correctly enough that the elements had found their right positions on their own. The January routing report closed the year. Cooper Distribution Group, $3.4 million gross revenue, 22% above the prior year. The fourth federal contract coming online in December had been the primary driver, combined with the holiday volume surge Terry had managed without incident. Federal revenue alone now represented just over half the total. Darnell reviewed it Sunday morning at his grandfather's desk. Not with ceremony, just the methodical attention he gave to all operational data, reading each line, noting the patterns, identifying where the next year's growth was most likely to originate and where the risks were concentrated. The risks were manageable. The growth trajectory was sound. He wrote the annual summary in the routing ledger in the same handwriting he had used since 2007. Consistent in its essential character, not unchanged because handwriting changed with use and years, but shaped by the same underlying discipline that had produced the first entry and every entry since. When he finished, he set the pen down and looked at the room. The desk that had been in his grandfather's warehouse for 22 years. The shelves he had built and fitted between the window and the closet door, the 4 ledger volumes in sequence on the middle shelf. He was 38 years old. He had incorporated a business at 20, with 2 leased trucks and a grocery contract won on his 3rd application. He had kept a handwritten ledger through 3 software migrations and the deaths of 2 people he had built the company in the presence of, and a marriage that had ended in a public room in a building he owned. He had not lost a single account through any of it. He had not missed a delivery deadline in 4 years. He had not performed his relevance in rooms where he was expected to, had not flinched when 30 people watched him for a reaction, had not let what others needed from him override what the work required of him. He was exactly where he was supposed to be, which was not contentment in the soft sense. It was something more precise. The orientation of a man who had assessed his position accurately and found it sound, who had identified the work that remained and was neither daunted by its scale nor impatient for it to be finished. It would be done when the conditions were right and the route was clear, and the sequence of prior movements had all completed in the correct order. The route ran on schedule. February came with the honest quality of February in Virginia. Not brutal, not forgiving, just present. Cold mornings that opened into pale afternoons that closed back to cold before 5. The James still running fast with winter rain, the trees bare and the city in its winter patience. Darnell drove to the convention center on a Thursday evening. Vanessa was presenting Friday morning, but had arrived Thursday afternoon and sent a message asking if he wanted to have dinner. He had suggested a restaurant on Carey Street, not the expense account kind, not the industry mixer kind. A place with good food and a room quiet enough to have a conversation in. She was there when he arrived. Sitting at the table with the small notebook in front of her and a glass of water and the settled quality of someone who arrived before they were expected and used the time, he sat down across from her. They looked at each other the way 2 people looked at each other when they had been talking by phone for 2 months. And this was the first time since Arlington that the conversation was happening with the full weight of physical presence. Richmond, she said. Virginia, he said. She looked at him with the dry precision he had come to understand was her version of warmth. You built all of this here. My grandfather built the foundation. I built on top of it. She considered that. And the house? 3 blocks from the river. You said the desk fit exactly. She nodded. The slow nod of someone receiving a piece of information and placing it correctly. I want to see it, she said. He looked at her. The desk, she said, and the floors. I want to see what the work looks like when it's done. It's 3 blocks from here, he said. I know. She picked up the menu. After dinner, they ate without hurrying. The kind of dinner where neither person was performing anything, the conversation moving without direction, covering the Woodbridge proposal, her grandmother's Jackson Ward seamstress operation, and the economics of reputation-based small businesses. The way federal procurement looked from the inside versus how it appeared from the proposal side. She asked questions that required him to think before answering. Not because the questions were complicated, because they were exactly precise, aimed at the thing beneath the surface, the element that carried the weight rather than the element that was visible. It was how she engaged with everything. Proposals, presentations, apparently dinner conversation. He found it clarifying in a way that was new to him, not because he hadn't been asked precise questions before, because being asked them by someone who already understood the answers and was asking anyway, because she wanted to hear how he framed them, was a different experience from being asked questions by people who needed him to simplify his response. He did not simplify. She did not need him to. They walked the 3 blocks to the bungalow after dinner. The February night was cold enough to show breath, not cold enough to be uncomfortable, just present. The way February in Virginia was present without demanding anything. The streets on the residential blocks near the river had the particular quality of old neighborhood lighting, warm and specific. He unlocked the front door. She stepped into the main room and looked at the floor, the hardwood in the evening light coming through the front windows, grain running east to west from the threshold to the back wall. The settled warmth of wood that had been correctly worked and had nothing left to prove. She did not speak for a moment then. "You did this yourself, yes." She walked through the main room into the kitchen, looked at the cabinets, ran one hand along the edge of a door. The shaker profile, the flush overlay, the hinges set with the precision that had taken 3 attempts on the first cabinet and 1 on each after. What's the stain? Provincial. Old masters. It looks original to the house. That was the point. She turned from the kitchen and looked at him across the main room. The lamp behind him, the February dark outside the kitchen window, the 2 rooms around them carrying the quality of spaces that had been built honestly and were now settled into what they were going to be. "Show me the desk," she said. He walked her to the second bedroom. She stood in the doorway and looked at it the way she had looked at the floors, with full attention, reading structural information from what she was seeing, the scale of it, the age in the surface, the brass pull on the right side drawer, the routing ledger open under the lamp. "Your grandfather's," she said. "Hull Street warehouse. 22 years." She looked at it for a long time, then, "My grandmother's ledger is in a glass case. The pages are too fragile to open." A pause. "Yours is still being written in." He looked at the open volume on the desk, the current week's entries in the left column, the handwriting consistent in its character across 17 years. Not unchanged, because nothing that was used and alive stayed unchanged, but shaped by the same discipline from the first entry to the current one. "Yes," he said. Something settled in the quiet of that second bedroom. Not a declaration, not a decision made out loud. The particular recognition that occurred when 2 people, who operated from the same underlying principles, found themselves in the same room with the evidence of those principles arranged around them and understood, without needing to name it, what that meant. He did not rush it. She did not require him to. They went back to the main room. She sat on the couch against the east wall. He made coffee in the kitchen and brought it out. They sat for another hour. The Woodbridge proposal, the spring contracting cycle, what Richmond looked like in April when the James slowed, and the city remembered it was a river city. She left at 11:15. At the door she said, "February in Richmond. Not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" She looked at him with the attention he had come to understand was not evaluation. It was the way she looked at things she was actually seeing. "Less," she said. He held the door. She walked down the front steps and along the sidewalk toward the hotel 3 blocks away. He watched until she turned at the corner. Then he closed the door, stood in the main room of the Westover Hills bungalow. He turned off the lamp, stood in the dark for a moment, the floors he had laid, the cabinets he had built, the desk in the second bedroom with the open ledger on its surface. Outside, the James River ran 3 blocks east. He could not see it from here, but he could feel it the way you felt the presence of something that had been moving continuously in one direction longer than any structure built alongside it, carrying everything that entered its current, pulling it forward toward the bay and the open water beyond. He had moved everything that needed moving. He had not lost a single piece. He went to bed. The alarm would come at 4:47. The first truck would clear the gate at 5:22. The morning would run its sequence and the week would follow, and the Woodbridge proposal would be built correctly this time, and the contract would come, and the desk would accumulate another year of entries in a handwriting that was his, and was also, in the way that mattered most, his grandfather's. He had always known where the foundation was. Everything else was the work of building on top of it correctly. And that work was nowhere near finished, which was exactly how he wanted it.